Welcome, everyone. Welcome, and I hope that you all had a restful evening and are ready for a full day because it promises to be very full and to be very exciting, I think, as well. I want to say a few things. First of all, today we'll be dealing with some fairly significant issues that may cause some emotions that are more challenging to deal with. So we've got some chaplains here that are willing to volunteer their time to talk to you if you need to speak to any of them today. And so those of you who are chaplains that have offered to do this, could you please stand? All right. I think right now it's just Kyle's the only one here. Thank you, Kyle. Appreciate it. The chaplaincy, since it's just Kyle, will be by appointment only. No, I'm teasing, of course. I'm teasing. I do want to recognize some folks real quickly. TJ York is the associate pastor here at this church, and he is also a Brite Divinity student working on his MDiv. And TJ's responsible, partially responsible, he's on the team who's set up all this wonderful technology today. So TJ, thank you very much. TJ's right back there in the plaid shirt, so appreciate that. I am going to introduce the first speaker today, and that is the Reverend Dr. Rita Brock. Rita and I have known each other for a couple of years now. We serve on the Veterans Coalition of Tarrant County Board together, and we collaborate together on a program called Rendezvous for Veterans program, and you'll hear more about that in our session today if you come to that. Got to know Rita a little bit better on the drive out here, and so Rita said to me, I said to Rita, we were going into a restaurant called Mary's Cafe in Colorado City, and we walked in and sat next to the necessary room entrance, and I ordered chicken fried steak, and she tried to find the healthiest thing on the menu. And I said, Rita, I'm sorry about this, but I don't know if you noticed, but I'm kind of a redneck. And she said, and I was expecting, when you say things like that, you're expecting a certain kind of an answer, and that answer is supposed to be, oh no, Charles, you're not a redneck, you're very sophisticated, you carry yourself well. Instead, Rita said, well, I sort of thought you were. And I said, well, what would make you think something like that? And she said, well, you're from Oklahoma. So that's so we've had conversations about that. We talked about where we've traveled. Rita's traveled extensively, and I told Rita, I said, not to be outdone, I said, Rita, I've been to Athens, Rome, Paris, Sudan, Nazareth, and Italy, and all without leaving Texas. I'd like to introduce the Reverend Dr. Rita Brock.
Thank you, Charles. What he didn't say is that I have a whole chunk of my family that are rednecks in Mississippi, so I like rednecks. Well, thank you all for being here and for being part of this event. As Charles said, I'm going to be talking about some really hard things this morning, but I hope that they'll be helpful to you as we move through the next day and a half together. I'm going to start with a scenario, and I just want you to imagine this, Imagine that you are driving in a convoy down a road in Iraq, and you are at the very back, you're in the last vehicle in the convoy, and you're riding, as it were, a shotgun. And convoys in Iraq learned to space their vehicles a certain distance apart so that if they had to stop, they wouldn't all be piled up on top of each other and a target for an attack all at once. So you're spaced back from the very front of the convoy, which you really can't see. And you know that one of the most dangerous things to do in a convoy is to stop. and that this road has a bridge across an arroyo. And bridges are the most dangerous places for convoys because bombs blow up bridges as you go across them, or they get blown up before you get there and force you to stop. There are all kinds of dangers associated with a bridge. And so you're getting kind of tense and alert because you know you're coming up near that bridge. And so you're scanning the horizon, you're looking for danger, your alertness is very high, and you see this figure on the horizon. And you can't quite make out who's under that burqa. But this figure is walking toward the bridge area. So you're watching this figure as it's getting closer, and the convoys go down the middle of the road as fast as they can go. That's the safest way to travel. So you're going fast, and suddenly it stops. The convoy stops. And this figure keeps walking toward the convoy. You have a decision in a very short amount of time to make about whether you're going to shoot this person or not. So, because you don't know whether it's just a woman trying to walk across the bridge to some other part across the arroyo, or it's somebody with a bomb, and the burqa's covering the bomb, a suicide bomber. You don't know, and you don't know who else has seen this figure, but you have not yet received an order to shoot, but the figure's getting kind of close to the front of the convoy. So the question I have for you is, would you shoot or not shoot? And that's about how long you'd have to make that decision. If you shoot, if you make you decide this is too dangerous and you could be a bomb, and nobody, you can't hear anything about what people are seeing, and you're nervous because you're stopped, and you decide to shoot because what if it is a person with a bomb? They could get close enough to blow up the front end of the convoy. So if you shoot, you won't know until after you make the decision what the outcome of that decision is going to be. It's very ambiguous. So if you shoot, and maybe the person did have a bomb strapped to their body, you find that out later. The convoy is stopped for some other reason up front. It wasn't a bomb or anything, but this figure was carrying a bomb. Then you probably saved a lot of lives in your company that day. You might even get some medals. People will buy you drinks that night and celebrate with you, and you might feel really good that you'd done your job, you'd done your duty as a combatant. You had taken out somebody who intended you and your company harm. And then you go home, and maybe 5, 6, 10 years later, you come upon a traffic accident or something, and there's something about the way the bodies are laying, or there's something about the blood and what you see that suddenly you remember this moment on that road. You remember seeing that body you shot. And you start to feel awful. You start to wonder how you could have celebrated killing somebody. That's a kind of moral injury. Or suppose you decide it's probably just a woman walking across the bridge, and you don't shoot, and your company does part of your company does get blown up. Now you've failed your duty. And you feel terrible. You are now responsible for people who died. That's a kind of moral injury. Or supposing you do shoot, but when the convoy starts moving, you sort of figure out who you've shot. You've just shot a woman who was trying to walk across the bridge to get home. Now you've shot an innocent civilian. And everybody gets taught the rules of engagement, and one of the things as a professional soldier you're not supposed to do is shoot innocent civilians. This is a violation of the code of soldiering. But of course in Iraq it's really hard. In the last wars we've been in, there aren't people in uniforms with guns pointed at you. They're people like a person in a burqa with a bomb strapped to their body. So you wind up shooting at civilians, and sometimes you don't know whether somebody with a cell phone is about to set a bomb off or is just calling home to find out what he needs to pick up for dinner. So if you shoot an innocent civilian, you may be able to say to yourself, well, I didn't know, and I did my best, but it may bother you still. Or suppose she's pregnant and your wife at home is pregnant. These are forms of moral injury. And they're the kind of attack on conscience, on your moral foundations that can afflict you for the rest of your life. So part of what we're doing at the Soul Repair Center is trying to help people understand how complicated moral injury is, how it's not one thing. It's sometimes something you failed to do. It's something you did. It's something that you witnessed. There are lots of ways that can challenge your sense of right and wrong or your own sense of goodness. I'm going to play you a video clip now from a man named Tyler Boudreau, who was a Marine captain in Iraq. And the context, this is a funny little clip because the context of it is that he is speaking to a city council meeting in Northampton, Massachusetts, and the city council had a resolution in front of it urging diplomacy with Iran instead of war with Iran. And I guess this was one of those moments when people were talking about we needed to bomb Iran or something, but that's just the context of the speech. And whatever you think about a city council voting something like this, what he has to say about his experience as a Marine captain who deployed to Iraq and then came home, I think a powerful testimony to the kind of suffering that comes home with war, including the kind of suffering that families also encounter with the context of being at a war.
Good evening, Tyler Boudreau, 42 East Center Street, Leeds. And I'll return the time to Francis when time comes later. I'd like to talk this evening about the resolution on Iran. I have 12 years in the Marine Corps Infantry. I was an infantry officer in Iraq. I participated in hundreds of combat operations. I understand warfare. Let me say first that if there comes a time that America deems it necessary to force a regime change in Iran, there will be troops on the ground. So as a veteran of our current war, let me share with you just a taste of what we can expect from a future war. My final assignment as a Marine officer was as the Rear Echelon Commander for 2nd Marine Regiment, 2nd Marine Division at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. The regiment was forward in Iraq, and for every casualty that they took, it was my job to call home to the families and let them know. I made a lot of calls. Sometimes I would only have to say my name, Captain Boudreau, United States Marine Corps, and that was enough. I would hear the voice on the other end of the line breaking down into tears. Because you see, they knew what my name meant. They knew that it meant something terrible had happened. And then I would have to confirm their suspicions and say, yes, something terrible has happened. Now I'll tell you, and I'm sure you can imagine, it was no easy task telling mom and dad that their boy was coming home without his face, or without his arms, or without his legs. The war itself paled in comparison to that. It was no easy task telling them that his body was burned badly, that his lungs were punctured, that his spleen was ruptured, that his colon was obliterated, that his femur was shattered. I cannot begin to describe for you their grief when I told them that. I held in my hand one night a casualty report about a Marine in Iraq, and he was going into surgery to have both his legs amputated. This report was 14 hours old. I didn't know his condition or his location. I didn't know if he'd made it through surgery or if he was alive or dead. All I knew was that he was alone in Iraq getting his legs cut off. And that is what I had to tell his mother. So you can expect that his mother did not receive me well. She screamed at me, she cried, she cursed me in the Marine Corps. Then she hung up on me, and then she called me back at midnight looking for updates. But there were no updates. So she called me back again at 1 and 2 and 3 in the morning. She was begging me for good news, but I didn't have any good news to give her because I wasn't in the good news business. And all the while, throughout this country, there was an epidemic spreading quietly, an epidemic of suicides among veterans. Thousands of them taking their own lives here in the safety of America for what can only be explained as an inability to reconcile the deeds that they've done in war with their sense of morality. What the suicide epidemic made me notice was that in all those casualty calls that I made, in all those wounds that I had to report to the families, hundreds of them, hundreds, never once did I pick up the phone and say to Mom and Dad, your son is coming home with a broken heart. Never once did I say that. In these times of war, it seems to me that our thoughts tend to linger on the battlefield, amongst those stories, glorious and tragic, of the service members in the fight. But in doing so, we can sometimes forget about the war's devastation right here at home, to our own families, and to our humanity as a people. I would like to see this community not forget and demand of our government that they exercise diplomacy rather than aggression. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Kind of media frenzy, I think, the last year or two, with stories about veterans with PTSD and the suicides that Tyler talks about, and the tragic consequences at home. So I think we are paying better attention to those things. But almost every story that I've seen around these questions, with very few exceptions, have pointed to PTSD as the most important invisible wound of war that's a factor in the suicide rates. And they ignore the fact that at the end of 2009, some VA clinicians, these are not religious people, they are psychiatrists and psychologists that work for the VA, published an essay on a topic they called moral injury, in which they suggested that actually moral injury might be a major factor in the suicide rates. And the longer I've worked on this issue the last 2 years, the more I am convinced that moral injury is a key piece in the whole system of suffering that comes home from war. And PTSD is part of that, but that moral injury is the thing that lingers and simmers and doesn't just go away. Neither does PTSD, but you can learn to control some of the symptoms. I'm not going to talk about PTSD because Bill Gibson, who is a VA clinician and counsels vets every day, is going to tell you more about that. But this essay on moral injury actually was the first time that the idea of moral injury was articulated as something separate from PTSD or distinct, not that they contradict each other, that you can have them both at the same time. But if you're just treating PTSD because that's what you think you're seeing and there are protocols for how you deal with PTSD, that you may miss the larger and deeper problem, which is moral injury. And so that was the thing that they said. And I got a hold of that essay before they published it. They sent it to a group of us working on a Truth Commission on Conscience and War. And when we read that essay, we thought, this is so crucial. And the Truth Commission commissioners and testifiers all said, we need to do public education and more research on moral injury. That's how the Soul Repair Center got founded. So this little diagram is from a guy named Bill Nash, who's a retired psychiatrist with the Marine Corps. And he lays out these two systems and symptoms. And so later this morning, Bill Gibson is going to talk about this cluster that's the trauma of PTSD. And I'm going to be talking about this other cluster over here, which is a different kind of suffering, called a kind of soul sickness, a broken heart that Tyler references. And just so you get a sense of the scale of this, the physical injuries estimated that people are still struggling with in the groups of troops that fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, the estimate is about 52,000 of them are still struggling with the physical injuries of war. But the estimate of the invisible wounds of war is the one we can't see, that are the PTSD, the moral injury, the anguish of war, afflicts, the estimate is 500,000, 500,000. So it's a tenfold larger number of veterans of the last two wars who are suffering invisible wounds. And so our job at the Soul Repair Center is to help people understand those wounds. And moral injury, because it has this moral quality, carries these, they're called moral emotions. There's a new move in philosophy back to looking at virtue ethics and looking at the kind of feelings that come with virtue ethics as a violation of a sense of moral virtue. And they are not the symptoms of PTSD, which is a fear reaction. So with the moral emotions, you experience intense sorrow or grief. You experience a kind of anger that's often a outrage. You may feel betrayed by leadership. You may feel betrayed by your government. You may feel betrayed by somebody in your own unit. And that has a moral quality of outrage to it. That's a kind of anger it's the same reason people get involved in fighting for justice. They're outraged. They're angry about things that are wrong. That's a moral emotion. That kind of anger is a moral emotion. Grief is another moral emotion, the sense that you have lost something really, really profoundly important to you and you feel broken by it. Regret for things you did not do or didn't stop. Shame, guilt, and then feeling like there's something so wrong with you morally that you don't want to share that with anybody. You feel alienated, isolated, and alone. Those are all forms of feelings that come with moral injury. And a simple way to explain it is that it's the kind of damage to your moral foundations or even the collapse of your moral foundations that come from conditions of extremity. And that isn't limited to war combatants. You can serve in the military and never have deployed to a war and experience moral injury. Somebody yesterday said, yeah, I was counseling a veteran who was raped in basic training, and she struggles with the moral questions about that. And some people, even in basic training, the training to kill bothers them. It just bothers them. They do it, but it still bothers them. So it can come under that condition. It can also happen to a person who works in law enforcement, prison guards. Right now, we're struggling with this Ebola epidemic, and the medical caregivers often have a sense that they violated their moral conscience and things they've had to do. There was an article about a year ago on moral distress in nurses because they're sometimes asked to lie to patients or they're asked to do things they think are wrong. So I don't want to paint a picture and make you think, well, only there's this group of people who've been to war as soldiers who have moral injury. I'm going to talk mostly about that because I think some of the worst kinds of it come from combat. But it afflicts many of us. It afflicts many of us. And the other thing about it is that you can live a long time and sort of put your moral issues aside, not think about it. Karl Marlantes, in his book, What It's Like to Go to War, said for 10 years he came back. He's a captain in Vietnam, and he wrote the famous Vietnam novel called Matterhorn. And then he wrote a memoir of his own experience, and he said, he came back, and for 10 years he thought he was fine because he was busy making a lot of money and working hard and doing all this international business stuff. And he said in 10 years, he just got slammed up against the wall, and his whole system crashed in on him, and he had PTSD and moral injury and all kinds of things. So you can sustain that. One of the people that Charles and I know on the board of VETCO, who was in the military, said he came home and for 6 months he thought he was fine. He was doing all the right things. He was clicking through job, work, family stuff. And 6 months out, his wife said, "You need to get help. You are not okay." And he said, "What do you mean I'm not okay?" She said, "You are not present. You are just vacated." She said, "You're going through the motions, but there's something wrong." He said it really saved him that she pushed him to do that. So it took him 6 months. We know someone who was a B-52 bomber pilot in the Cold War, never served in combat. 40 years out, he's thinking about that. 40 years out, it's starting to bother him. So how does this all happen? I think one of the things that as civilians, those of us who are civilians don't understand is how basic training, how the military can take an ordinary person who's 18 to 25 or so, an ordinary person, and in 8 to 12 weeks have a professional soldier. And they do it partly by an intense, completely ritualized process that is a way of bonding people into a unit, taking away their personal identity. Basic training is not about your own personal success. It's about how your unit is going to succeed in life or death conditions and how you're going to be part of this unit and keep everybody alive, including yourself. So there's a kind of high-stakes situation in basic, and then everything from sleeping to eating to walking is ritualized. And there's now a lot of neuroscience work on how the kind of repetition of a skill set that ritual has you do is what makes it possible to learn something fast. So like my own personal experience, I went from being a kind of mediocre stem cell turning intermediate downhill skier, and in 1 week of 8 hours a day of following a ski instructor in a class, I went up 2 levels. In 1 week. Just because it was all day long, try to do what the instructor was doing, repeat, 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 try. And so at the end of that week, I didn't have to think about it. My body would just do it. So it's that ritual process and with guides and pressure that will change a person. And the military training is also a training in a moral system. Now, sometimes when I talk about basic training or military training, somebody will say, "Oh yeah, we teach them to be killers." And that's the last thing you should think. What we train people to be is professional members of the military. And that comes with a very clear moral code. You don't shoot. There's a whole Geneva Conventions, there's a whole just war conventions, there's a whole series of rules around how a professional soldier behaves in combat. And as Pete Kilner, who teaches ethics at West Point, says, morality in war is more important than anywhere else because you send in people with so much lethal force that if you don't have a way where you have orders and conditions under which they use that force, you're just sending in a murderous mob. So even the killing is under orders. There's a whole process of basic training that is crucial to the creation of a professional military. And then that training is tested in combat. That's where it's both annealed, it's hardened, it's made deeper, and it's tested to see if it works. So the life or death conditions of combat mean that if you don't do your particular job as best you can do it, there will be serious consequences not only for yourself but for other people. So there's also an intense value system in the military about your life meaning a lot to other people, and that the work you do means a lot to other people. There are very few civilian contexts where that's true. It's interesting how in the military, service to others and caring about other people is part of the moral code of the military. The problem with all that, of course, is war isn't that clean. The term fog of war has a meaning to it, which is that you get in there and it's often like the woman in the burqa, it's often hard to tell what is the right thing to do. So people constantly struggling. And that's why the moral injury piece, I think, is so huge, a piece that's sort of the big elephant in the room. That you may be trying to do your very best and fail. And not know how to handle that kind of failure. The film Korengal, which is Sebastian Junger's second film about Camp Restrepo in the Korengal Valley, is interesting because the first one was about how war happens and what takes place. The second film is about the people who fought there after they've been home a while. And this young man who's a really gung-ho soldier and survives at the camp and comes home, he says, I'm not a religious person or anything, but I think God hates me for what I did over there. And he missed it so much he wanted to go back. So even with the ambiguities, even with the difficulties, there's a quality of intensity and urgency and bonding. I think part of the thing that's missed is that unit bonding. People so miss their unit. That is part of having to come home. It's why Tyler says war is just the foyer to hell. It's the coming home part that's really hell. And I'm not going to spend a long time on this because this could be a whole day in itself, but I want to talk a little bit about the challenges that women in this system face. There's an increasing number of women in the military, and now women are allowed in combat. So the Marines, I think about 6 months ago, trained their first integrated combat unit. Women have been now this is an important thing to know, women have been in combat units since 1993, but they were not allowed to be in the fight. They did support roles. They might be a mechanic or they might be something else, but they weren't allowed to be on the front lines of the fight. Lioness is a film about a group of women who were trained from different military units to follow the front guard in a combat unit, to do the sort of like search the women, because men can't search Muslim women, search the women after the front fighter unit had gone through. So they actually saw quite a lot of combat, and one of them actually got caught in a firefight and killed somebody. But they're not supposed to actually be in the firefight, but they can be right behind it. They just didn't get combat pay. So the women have been in that situation since 1993. What that means is unless they're in a nursing unit or something, they're in the minority. Jessica Goodell's memoir, Shaded Black, talks about how she was the only woman in the first Marine mortuary unit in Iraq. And she has an entire chapter. If you want to know something about what it's like to be a woman in the military, she has an entire chapter on what that's like, including all the different strategies that the women she knew were using. This is not the officer corps, this is the enlisted corps. The strategies that women were using not to get sexually assaulted. And one woman just basically had sex with each person in her unit one at a time so she wouldn't get raped. Others would stop drinking water at 4 p.m. in, the desert where it's 120 degrees, where they would stop drinking water at 4 o'clock so they wouldn't have to go to the latrines at night, because that was a prime area for assault. Jessica used a picture of another Marine in a nearby unit that was a friend of hers, allowed her to use his picture to pretend he was her boyfriend. He was kind of mean looking. And it was like her protection. This is a picture on her locker door. But the units, they're integrated in combat. They sleep in the same bunks. And so women have to cope with all of that. And it's, of course, a hyper-masculine culture. So they also are proving themselves often against their own gender sort of upbringing. So women veterans, Kim Olson, who was a colonel in the Air Force, talks about, she works now with women veterans, and she says a lot of them won't even call themselves veterans because they think veterans are men. And the struggle for women coming home is to reclaim a female identity. So she talks about a woman who had an amputation in her leg, and she was in the hospital. She got well, she was fine. They were going to make her a prosthetic device, and she was going to leave, but she was depressed the whole time. And they couldn't figure out why she was still depressed. They finally got somebody to talk to her enough that she asked this question. She said, will I ever be pretty again? And nothing had happened to her face, or she just lost a leg, which is no small thing, but it wasn't that she wasn't still looking like who she was. And they wondered what that meant. So some woman asked her, what did she mean about being pretty again? And it turns out she liked to wear high heels. And the prosthetic devices are made for men. And you can't wear a high heel with a foot that won't bend. So that staff went down to talk to the guy who made the prosthetic devices in the hospital and said, could you make a foot that could wear a high heel? And he said, I never thought about it. He said, let's see if I can do it. And he made one, so which perked her up enormously. And so the entire hospital staff took up a collection and bought her a pair of Prada high heels. So she walked out of the hospital in Prada high heels. And it sort of seems like a small thing, but the struggle for her was, how am I going to be a woman again after all this has happened to me and I'm missing my foot? And so there are these struggles. And the one thing I want to say is that women are disproportionately about 3 times more likely to be sexually assaulted in the military, but the 53% of the victims are men. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind. It's not just a woman's problem. It's disproportionately a woman's problem, but it's a pervasive problem for men as well in the military. So, as Tyler says, coming home is hell. And part of that is because there's just so much grief and loss that come home from war. There's the usual stuff you would think of. You lost your best friend in battle. You failed to protect people in your company. You lost so many people that you can't take it in. So you're carrying that kind of grief of just sheer death. And there is something, I think we don't, as civilians, think about this so much, but we have a sense of the sanctity of the human body. And that sanctity of the human body, even non-religious people have this. The sense of private space is determined by a cultural value system that says, if you step through this invisible line, you are violating me in some way. Right? I had this happen. I sponsored a Chinese student for 4 years to go to college where I was teaching. And so one of the ways I helped her with her expenses was she lived with me. And the first time it was in Minnesota, the first cold day, I had a fireplace. I put a fire in the fireplace, and she'd come home from classes, and And she said, "Oh, that's so pretty." And she came and she sat down. And I was sitting on the floor in front of the fire. An American would have come and sat a couple of feet away, or maybe on a chair on the other side of the room. She came down and sat right next to me and took my arm. And I thought, I was uncomfortable. It was like she'd somehow stepped into my personal space in a way that bothered me. And I was uneasy, but I couldn't identify exactly why. But we all have that sense. We have that sense of you've crossed some line. And it has a moral quality. Because when a stranger does that to us, we think less of them, or we might even not like them. Or we have a negative response, and it has a kind of moral quality. So imagine being in a place where you are around blood, guts, and gore all the time, where bodies are violated all the time, and how devastating that can be. The mortuary units have very, very high depression rates. It's a terrible thing to have to handle body parts all the time. Jessica Dell's job was to take body bags full of parts and find matching pieces to put one body in a bag to send home to a family. And sometimes there would only be a hand or a head or maybe 3 pieces of a body to put in a bag. This is devastating work. So that kind of loss of death is huge coming home from war. But there are other losses that we often don't think about. When I was doing this, a guy who was in my audience said, "You have to add a thing to your list." I hear this. He was a counselor at the VA. He said, "I hear this all the time from the guys I counsel. They miss their weapon." Now think about it. Think about if you know a 12-year-old with a smartphone, if you took that phone away from them. My cousin Joseph would go ballistic because it's like almost part of his body. It's like he uses it all the time. Think about being trained with this gun, sleeping with this gun, learning to take it apart and put it together in the dark, knowing every piece of it automatically, how to use it, not even having to think about it anymore, the way you would use your arm. Yes, right. So it's like phantom limb pain. I think that's the best way to think about what happens when you take somebody's gun away from them after they've been in an infantry unit and fought. They often name their gun. They have that kind of personal relationship to it. So you have to put that on your list. That's a kind of loss we don't pay any attention to. And I actually think it would be interesting to ritualize a replacement item for people who miss their gun. That's another loss. You miss your best friends. For an 18, 22-year-old, the people in their unit may be the most important and deepest friendships they had. And then they lose their unit. If they've lost their friend in battle, they've lost their best friend. They lose often their sense of innocence and goodness because a lot of them go in with idealistic reasons for wanting to serve their country and serve others, and then they come home devastated because of what they've seen. That's what happened to my friend Kevin Benderman. He really wanted to serve his country, and then what he saw so devastated him that he actually chose to go to prison for a year rather than redeploy. So you can lose that sense of innocence and be devastated. You can lose your family because when you come home, you're different. You're never going to be the person who left. Your family is expecting the person who left. But your family has also functioned without you. So you may have a new baby at home. Like Kyle said, he missed the birth of one of his children. You may have a new baby at home. So your spouse is totally different because they're focused around this new birth. Your children have grown several months or a year or whatever. And with little kids, a year is a huge change. Your family may now be doing things that you used to do for them, so you're feeling kind of useless. So that's a loss. It's a very serious loss. There's a very high divorce rate in the veteran population because families are so devastated by all this. These are profound losses. And perhaps the worst one is you lost yourself. You lost any moorings in a sense of who you were or any kind of worthwhileness. You lose your faith in that process often. and you decide you don't deserve to live, or it's just too hard to try to stay alive. So these are all losses that we need to attend to that come home from war. And I have a veteran I talked to when I was doing this talk in Chicago, and he said, you're just so isolated. You don't want to talk to, it's just such awful stuff. He said, you don't want to talk to your family. You don't want this stuff in their heads. So you're going to talk to your family, and you really just don't want to talk about it because it's just going to bring up so much and so painful. And he said, so you just basically lock everybody out. And these masks that I've been showing were made by a group in Canada, veterans in Canada who fought in Afghanistan, when their therapist asked them to draw a mask of how they felt about their war experience. And this mask so captures that sense of isolation, of not wanting anyone to see who you are, that sort of dead look in the eyes so that people can't see your soul because it feels so terrible to you, and feeling trapped by intense feelings of things that you cannot express and not speak of. And he said, and this veteran in Chicago said, yeah, he said, and people always say, well, tell me your story or talk to me or I want to hear from you. And he said, they don't know what they're asking. They don't know what they're asking me to tell them. He said, so I had some easy stories. He said, so if somebody asked me, how was your experience? He said, I would tell them one of the easy stories. And if they got upset by that, I knew that was all they could handle, and they were never going to hear the other stuff. So that's the other part of this, is that veterans won't talk about their experience because they feel like they'll be judged or that they're going to traumatize somebody else. So that's this sense of alienation and isolation that comes from this experience of moral injury, this sense of guilt or shame or remorse or grief that you're carrying inside you. And it's a really difficult thing to even start talking about. And yet, the first stage in a process of recovery is being able to talk about it. Otherwise, it's just locked inside of you. And tomorrow morning, I'm going to talk more about what the process of recovery is. We have at least one workshop this afternoon on storytelling. It's a really, really, Joanne Braxton, my friend Joanne Braxton's teaching it, is a really, really important piece of just being able to get to that sense of stuff that's the isolation factor. So this is just a little summary of some of the points I've made about moral injury. It doesn't necessarily happen right away. I know so many ministers, when I do this talk, would say, oh yeah, I had this World War II vet who was in hospice care and he was dying and he asked to see me and he had to make a confession about something that happened to him in war that he had been carrying his whole life and told no one. But he didn't want to die without telling somebody. So this is a common occurrence for a lot of clergy who have older vets in their congregations. So it can come at that point, or it can come right after the event. My friend Camilo Mejia was looking down his gun sights at a young man holding a grenade, and he thought to himself, he's too far away to do any harm, and he's thinking about whether he should shoot or not, and the next thing he knows, he's seeing the guy in a pool of blood, and the people in a crowd are pulling him back through this pool of blood, and he's limp corpse. And he doesn't remember pulling the trigger of his gun. He was given the order to shoot, he found out later, but he doesn't remember what happened. But he remembers thinking, as he's looking at that young man in his gun sights, he remembers thinking, if I shoot him, I'm going to cross some moral line in myself, some Rubicon I'll never get back across. So when he saw the man lying in a pool of blood, he didn't know for sure if he killed him. He didn't know if he'd been the one to shoot. So he went into a closet in this building they were in and counted his gun magazine, and he'd shot 11 bullets. And that's when he knew he'd killed him, and he felt awful. So his sense of moral injury happened coterminous with the experience that led him, when he came back, to refuse to redeploy. And he's another person who chose 8 months in prison over redeploying. He just couldn't go back. So it can happen that fast, or it can accumulate over years. It's not new. This is really important to remember, that moral injury is ancient. It's in the Bible. You don't have to look too far to see it. I think Kyle sort of helped us understand some of that last night. It's in the Bhagavad Gita, which is about a warrior raising all these moral questions about why you should fight or not fight. That's an ancient Hindu text. It's in great war literature. Jonathan Shea, who's on our board of the Soul Repair Center, was a VA psychiatrist and counseled Vietnam vets for 20 years, realized that what he was hearing from the Vietnam vets that he was counseling sounded an awful like Achilles in the Iliad. So he wrote a book called Achilles in Vietnam, and a second book, Odysseus in America, in which he takes the Odyssey's 10 years of struggle as a metaphor for what it's like to come home from war. It's fascinating how he did this. Well, he won a MacArthur Genius Award, not for his work on PTSD, but for seeing this in Homer and reading Homer through the eyes of war veterans, which no one had ever done before. And yet, it's like one of those child, puzzle pictures where it looks like a tree, and then you're asked to see all the faces in the leaves, and you start seeing faces in the leaves, and you can no longer see that tree without those faces. Moral injury is like that. I can no longer read the Bible, I can no longer read war literature without immediately seeing the moral injury. It's just there. So it's in every war. As I said, it's also in the civilian population. It happens under conditions of extremity, and the only people who can't have moral injury are psychopaths. So it's also profound I think it's in our society. And it's also something, if you do caregiving, you have to watch. You have to have a self-care process. You have to have a way that you have somebody else that you talk to, and you have a way of making sure you hold a kind of boundary so you don't get swept into the trauma. Because one of the things, Susan Thistlethwaite is a friend of mine, and I did a piece recently in Huffington Post about what helps people recover from moral injury. What helps make that even possible so they don't self-destruct. And we call that the thing that makes recovery possible as a kind of soul space. It's an ability, even when you violated your own conscience, it's an ability to understand that this is something you did, but it doesn't define everything about what you are. So Larry Dewey, in his book War and Redemption, talks about how he's also a VA psychiatrist. He says the worst cases, the people who had the hardest time getting well, trying to recover from the awful depressions and things they were in, he said the people who had the hardest struggle were the people who, as he said, broke the Geneva Conventions of their soul. They actually got elated by killing. They liked it. Or they killed out of fury and vengeance. They were angry or wanted vengeance, and so they killed not on orders as a professional soldier, but just because they wanted vengeance. Or they killed their own, the friendly fire thing. He said they had the hardest time getting over their moral injury. And I think it's because they became the killing. They had no separate space that wasn't the killing. That their whole being was sort of wrapped up, their feeling system, their heart, everything was wrapped up in the killing. And so they didn't have this other place like Camillo had where he thought, if I do this, it's not going to be good. I think Camillo has been able to recover because he had this other consciousness of something else in him that was his moral conscience. And he actually had a therapist say to him, he was being treated for PTSD, his therapist said to him, well, you shouldn't be so hard on yourself, you know. The guy had a grenade, and maybe he wasn't close enough then to do you harm, but he might have killed your whole unit later. He was really dangerous, and you did your job as a soldier. You were ordered to shoot, and you took him out. You shouldn't be so hard on yourself. And Camilla's response to that was, intellectually, I agree with you, but I don't feel any better. And he has decided, and I think this is partly his own recovery process, he has decided that if he is a moral human being, he should never feel okay about killing another human being. And he said, what I've come to accept is I'm not going to feel good about it. And I'm okay with that. But I think his ability to say that is this other place in himself that can say, I am a moral person. And I have done things that violated my core sense of moral foundation. So I have to live with that, and I have to build a life that, as he says, can restore some balance of good in the world after all the harm. So it's not a simple process. I think one of the, and I'll just end with this, one of the ways I've been changed by this work, which has helped me understand something more about moral injury. I used to do rape, crisis, and domestic violence work. And if a woman who had been raped started saying things like, well, I shouldn't have gotten drunk, or I thought that guy was funny and I probably shouldn't have gone with him on that date, or I shouldn't have walked there that day. Now, of course, the legal system wants to say, so she's to blame for being raped. But our response was always to say, no, you didn't do anything to cause this rape. This is something that somebody else did to you. You had nothing to do with it happening to you. But in fact, what we were then telling her, she was a helpless victim. That she had no power to do anything. And what Kristen Leslie, who's a national expert on military sexual trauma, and what Judith Herman in her book Trauma and Recovery says, is the people who have experienced that kind of violence, when they're saying, I shouldn't have gotten drunk, or I shouldn't have worn that kind of clothing that day, or I should have gone a different route to work, or whatever, or with children who are molested, I shouldn't have made my parent mad at me, or what. That kind of thinking is not so much about them trying to take blame, although sometimes it is, but it's really about their trying to manipulate what happened to them in a way that gives them some power. And that little bit of power they're trying to take out of the situation is the little bit of power they have to recover. Because now they're thinking, next time I can maybe have a little more power in the situation. And that is actually a healthy impulse. And what I have seen in the moral injury process is that, Camilla was ordered to shoot. So it was his job to do that. And he could say, well, it's not my fault because I was ordered to shoot and there was nothing else I could have done in the situation. He's not willing to do that. He's willing to say, I did it. And maybe I had to do it, but I did it. And that sense of being willing to take some power in the situation is an important part in the recovery process. It's also how, when you start hearing stories from vets and they start talking about things that happened to them, they need to tell that story over and over and over again in order to do that kind of puzzling through it. And they'll tell the story in different ways at different times. Joshua Castile, who's in our book Soul Repair, he went to the Iowa Writers Workshop and became a playwright. He said one of the most therapeutic things that happened to him as a playwright was that he could write characters that were all these arguments he was having in his own head with himself. He said, and it was really therapeutic to externalize these and watch these arguments in his head being performed by actors. And so that's part of the storytelling process, is the ways you're arguing with yourself, you're puzzling out, trying to find some agency, some personal agency in the process that is the agency that will help you recover. And I work a lot with military chaplains so that they can understand the moral injury questions. And one of the things I say to them is, I think one of the most important jobs of the military chaplain is to help people hold that soul space in the midst of some of the worst things that human beings ever do to themselves and to each other, is to help them understand, this is your job, you have to do it well, you're a professional soldier, but there's this other piece of you that's your conscience, that's your soul, your moral space, your spirit. And that's that little bit of self that people can hold on to, that when they finally get home and they face into all the terrible things that they've had to do and done, that's the little part of the agency that helps them start to think critically and recover. And that's a crucial, it's what Donald Winnicott, a psychoanalyst, calls a play space. It's that sense of self-other distinction, so that you aren't the killing, you aren't one thing, but you have a self-other distinction that gives you a breathing space in between those two things that allows you to start to manipulate and think about them. He's describing it in children, but I think as adults we need it even more because of the awful things that sometimes we have to do and face into, that we have to live with for the rest of our lives. So I just want to end with a story about Camillo's kind of recovery. He's a story to me of someone who's, you're always, in some ways you're always recovering from moral injury, but it's a sign to me of these steps that he's taken. And one of those is that when he came home from Iraq and after killing someone, he wondered if he could ever be a decent father to his 10-year-old daughter, because how could he teach her right from wrong? And so he was really struggling with that, and he's really worked hard to establish, he shares custody of her, and he's worked really hard to establish a relationship to his daughter Samantha. And last January, Coleman Baker and I had Camillo Skype in as a guest speaker in our course on moral injury at Brite. And he did a great job, and he talked about this sense of accepting that he's never going to feel good about killing someone and trying to restore the balance of good in the world. And I think he had mentioned that Sam was in the next room, that his daughter was in the next room, and I thought, well, that's kind of odd. She's like 13, why is she in school? And so when I called him to thank him, I said, is Sam sick? And he said, oh, no. He said she had head lice that she caught at school. And he had told this story to the class in the Skype interview about how one time he had gone ballistic when Sam had been late to be picked up from school, and he got there and she wasn't there, and he went into a full-blown panic, and he started driving around thinking she'd been kidnapped, and he did this sort of massive panic, and then when he got back there, she was there, and he just landed on her with both feet and said, well, he just started ranting and telling her, it was like he just was upset. And he got halfway through this rant, and he realized what he was doing. And he stopped, and he said, so I said to her, okay, I'm upset. You need to understand that I've been through some really bad things, and I thought something bad happened to you, and I got really upset. I need you to be on time or to tell me if you're going to be late. He said, because, I realized that most other fathers wouldn't respond this way, but unfortunately, I'm the only father you have. And he felt bad about that. So he told that story to our class. So when I called him on the phone, he said, no, Sam was home with head lice. And I said, really? He said, yeah. He said, I spent, except for the hour I talked to your class that day, I spent the rest of the day combing. She has this gorgeous tumble of curly black hair down to her waist. She's a gorgeous head of black hair. He said, we didn't want to shave her head. And he said, so I was combing knits. I don't know, I've never done this, but he said I was combing knits out of her head for the entire day. And he said, and it took all the way to 9 o'clock that night. And he said, and so she was with me all day because we were combing knits out of her hair. He said, but you know, he said, at 9 o'clock we got done, she went in and washed her hair, and then she tweeted, I have the best dad in the whole world. I think Camilo is about as far as you need to get at this point in his life with recovery. Thank you. And we have a few minutes for Q&A if you want to do that. I'll be around the whole conference, so if you want to talk to me one-on-one, I'm happy to do that too. But I think we have about 5 minutes. Yeah.
Are the dynamics different when you're dealing with fighter pilots and bomber pilots versus ground soldiers?
Well, I think people in different military units have different experiences of warfare. But there's now been some work with drone pilots who aren't even in theater. And they have PTSD and moral injury rates also. So I think that the extremities of the kind of situation you're in combat may have particular effects on you that are different from people who have different kinds of jobs. But I think that moral injury is so varied. I mean, some people can do something and not have moral injury, and the same person can do that and have moral injury. So it's not exactly the job you do, although I think it is hard. There is research on veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan who've actually killed in combat, and Shira McGann at the San Francisco VA has been doing this work, and she's found a 2 to 3 times higher suicide rate in the vets who've killed than other vets. And other vets have a 3 times higher suicide rate than the general population. So there seems to be especially a negative effect of direct killing. But, you know, Dwaylen Pfeiffer, who's the son of Dr. Pamela Lightsey, who's a dean at Boston University Theological School, Dwaylen says his job was intelligence gathering. He was 19 when he crossed the border from Kuwait to Iraq as a rear guard for a 1st Patriot missile unit that went across the border. And he said his job was to collect information coming in from the people in the field about where they were and where they were spotting the enemy, and all these geographical pieces of information that he had to do on a mapping system and report to his commanders. He was a private, I think, at that time, maybe a corporal. And then those commanders would tell him to give these orders out to commanders in the field. So he was kind of this intelligence pipeline, receiving information and delivering orders. He said he never shot anybody. He wasn't on the front lines. He was doing intelligence gathering, and he didn't even agree with the war. He thought the war was a bad war, but he felt like his job was to keep everybody in his unit alive, and that's what he focused on. And he said, I worked 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, because I wanted to keep my unit alive. That was my response. I felt that as a heavy responsibility. That when he came home, he felt awful about having been there at all. That he really didn't think the war was a good war. That began to sink in after he came back and the urgency wore off. And Camilo, Kevin Benderman, a lot of them have come back, and as this experience of moral injury started to settle in, they've rethought their own understanding of war. So Kevin is now a pacifist. Camilo is also a pacifist. Not everybody goes there. Tyler certainly isn't. But that's one thing that can happen to people as the questions start to settle in deeper, even if they never fired a shot. One of my, there's a man who was a Unitarian Universalist, I forget the name of the organizations, it's like the AFSC. He was a fighter pilot in Vietnam. And after one bombing raid on Cambodia, he came back and told his commander he didn't want to fly any more bombing raids. He'd experienced his moral injury after that last bombing raid. He said, this is wrong, I'm not going to do any more. And so his commander said, okay, well, we'll reassign you. And so they sent him to this other location. Well, they put him in a mental hospital for the war. He basically got imprisoned because he refused to fly any more missions. But he became the head of an organization. It's a peace-based organization. He didn't see combat on the ground. He just flew bombs. But as I said, that we have a B-52 bomber pilot that some of us at Brite have gotten acquainted with, who flew in the nuclear division, and he said to us once, I'm now wondering who I was as a 23-year-old that I was willing to drop 42 tons of nuclear material on Russia. For 4 years I said yes to doing that if called upon to do it. What kind of human being would do that? He didn't even do it. It's just thinking that he was capable of it that really, really bothers him. Yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question, but it's very complicated. I haven't found a way to generalize about what conditions make it worse, what conditions, it's partly what your own soul tells you, and how much of that you cannot listen to for a long time. Yes. Moral injury as a diagnosis, there isn't one. There is not. There's a psychometric that Bill Nash at the VA, or who's put together that the VA uses, that measures whether or not you might have it. And there is a protocol that Shira McGinn and Brett Litz have done called adaptive disclosure, that's like 8 treatments where you have them talk about it, and imagine talking to the victim, imagine talking to a benevolent moral authority and things like that. But there's nothing in the diagnostic manual that says moral injury and here are the symptoms and that's how you know somebody has it. The VA is trying to create that so they can treat it. But the VA really can't treat something that doesn't have a formal diagnosis, and at this point, as far as I know, there's no formal diagnosis for moral injury. And partly, I don't know what I would say I would resist, but I'm nervous about this idea of a psychiatric diagnosis for moral injury because most of the veterans I know don't think there's anything wrong with them that they feel this way. That this is a normal human response to conditions of extremity, and if you turn it into a pathology, it starts to stigmatize vets who are already stigmatized because of PTSD, when in fact PTSD is also 7% of the civilian population has it. It's also a thing your brain just does for you to protect you from danger, from repeated overdoses of fear. So one of the reasons that our interest is in working with congregations is that religious communities actually kind of understand soul sickness. We may not handle it very well, but when I talk to clergy and I talk to them, they go, well, is that sort of like sin? I say, well, it's a little like sin, but sin is such a stigmatizing word now that, and I think it's more complicated than just what used to be called sin because it carries also a whole lot of other things in it. But religious, I think that this is just this little backstory and then I'll quit. The reason I got so interested in the moral injury piece is when I read that VA essay, that original VA essay, and they outlined this 8-step protocol, this adaptive disclosure protocol. I had, for a previous project that I had written with Rebecca Parker called Saving Paradise, we had done an enormous amount of research on the ancient penance system for warriors. And I thought that the protocol the VA was having the veteran imagine in one-to-one therapy, mapped almost entirely directly onto the ancient penance system. And I thought, nobody uses that anymore in Christianity except AA. But it had, I thought, why would you ask somebody in therapy to imagine a conversation with a benevolent moral authority. Why wouldn't you want to train moral authorities to help vets have these conversations? Why wouldn't you want a community to be with them through this process and offer them a way to accept and recover and build a new moral identity, rather than having them imagine a community they could confess to? So the adaptive disclosure process is all about one person in a context of counseling imagining these things. But imagination can only take you so far, right? So why not religious counselors who have a pretty sophisticated training in questions of God and evil, and questions of forgiveness, and what is responsible forgiveness rather than a kind of cheap forgiveness? What does self-acceptance mean? These are all things that people who go to seminary mostly have to study. They do at Brite. They have to learn this stuff at Brite. Michael can tell you about that. These are important things. And so that's why I think the training of religious communities is so important around these questions, because there isn't a diagnosis at this point, and yet it's a clear affliction. It's a clear kind of suffering and anguish that affects so many people. Michael, we'll end with Mike. Michael gets the last word. They turned my mic off, so go ahead.
Yeah, I didn't do that. I don't have any controls over here.
No, I was out of time. Go ahead, Michael.
I was wondering if you think perhaps the reason they're prompted to abandon these communities is that there was not actually a church that listened.
Yeah. Okay. I guess they turned it back on. Yes. There are. That's why we're trying to do this work with communities. Is that I think there always have been, and the VA has chaplains, but I think that the fact that moral injury in the clinical community is not understood. I mean, people who get PhDs in psychiatry or psychology or MDs in psychiatry often don't study anything religious. So for them to be doing the counseling seems to me highly limited.
Thank you so much, Rita. Appreciate that. Thanks. We're going to take a short break now, and we'll come back in here at 10:30 to hear Dr. Bill Gibson.